We've been learning about how gender is socially constructed. It starts with the way in which we view our biology, and in our society, that means distinguishing between men and women. In other words, the meaning and interpretation we give to our biology becomes a part of our, quote, objective reality. Because we think in dualistic terms in our culture, our sex categories are limited to two, male and female. It's second nature for us now. But remember that reality can be different from one culture to another, and this is where it becomes difficult to ignore the evidence for social constructionism. If you compare different cultures and find that they do something differently, that indicates that this is something that is socially constructed. This means that cross-cultural comparisons are crucial to phenomenological research, and you can approach these comparisons in a couple different ways. First, you can look at two or more different time periods within a single society. Because cultures change over time, what you are doing in effect is a cross-cultural comparison. The advantage of this approach is that you can examine how a culture has changed over time. The second thing you can do is compare the cultures in two or more societies. Clearly, there are likely to be very different cultures here, which will really emphasize our recognition for differing realities. While this approach doesn't allow us to see how cultures have changed over time, it does have the advantage of highlighting how fundamentally different each culture's underlying assumptions and premises really are. This approach is what we're going to emphasize now. Our first example comes from Juquitan, a town in the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. Here you'll find the Muxes, who stand outside of the gender binary and who represent a third sex. The indigenous culture of the region is Zapotec. Muxes are fully embraced within this culture. In fact, parents are considered blessed to have a Muxe child. The reason is that while other children will grow up to move out of the home and have children of their own, Muxes stay close to their parents and care for them as they grow old. Muxes are also highly valued for the artistry and craftsmanship they bring to creating clothing with a distinctive indigenous style, so they're credited with helping to preserve an ancient culture that might otherwise be threatened with extinction. In India, there is also a third gender called Hijra. There are an estimated 5 to 6 million Hijra in India. This is a very diverse group of people who identify as neither male nor female and can range from eunuchs to intersex individuals to cross-dressers. Hijras commonly live in communes and traditionally undergo an extensive initiation process, which traditionally included castration. For centuries, they have regularly performed at weddings and childbirths in exchange for payment. According to religious folklore, Hijras have the power to bless one with fertility, but also assign curses. And because of this power, for much of Indian history, Hijras acquired significant respect as an important group of ascetic people. But in today's India, the Hijras are largely stigmatized, often functioning as an institutionalized third gender, but with little access to education, jobs, and good housing. This stigmatization began as a result of the British colonization of India and the imposition of laws, similar to our colonial legacy in the United States, outlawing any cultural expressions that allowed for what they saw as same-sex sex. We'll look at this more closely when we get to the topic of sexuality. Over the years, with increasing ostracism, Hijras have often been relegated to a life of begging, prostitution, and extortion. In 2010, however, the Supreme Court of India did officially recognize the Hijra as a third sex, though same-sex sex was still punishable as an offense until the summer of 2018. Let's consider a third example. Among a number of Native American tribes, there are people known as Two-Spirit. The Two-Spirit took many different forms, varying widely depending on the tribe, though not all tribes recognize this two-spirit. I'm going to focus on the Cheyenne and how they approached the two-spirit. The Cheyenne identified 4 different genders, and here's how it worked. They distinguished between a person's body and their spirit, and both of these had a gender. Sometimes a person's body and spirit would have the same gender, or a person's body and spirit could have different genders. This results in 4 different combinations: male males, female males, male females, and female females. In this list, the first word represents the gender of the body, and the second word represents the gender of the spirit. The 2 genders in the middle, the ones in which the gender of the body and the spirit are different from one another, these are the ones considered to be two-spirit. You might wonder how they would determine whether a child was two-spirit or not. They had a ritual for determining this. When a child was about 8 years old, they would be put in a teepee with 2 toys, a bow and arrow and a doll. The child was told they could only bring one of the toys out with them to play. If the child chose the bow and arrow, it meant that their spirit was male. If they chose the doll, then their spirit was female. Among the Cheyenne, two-spirits were actually pretty common. They were considered a sign of luck for a tribe and a source of healing. They often took on a shamanistic role within the tribe, blessing children and giving them a secret name that was known only to the child and the shaman two-spirit. The Cheyenne were a polygamous culture in which a man could have more than one wife. Generally, only the first wife was responsible for bearing children. This means that sometimes the second wife was two-spirit. The two-spirits with a male body and a female spirit helped to raise children, prepared food, and built teepees, while the two-spirits with female bodies and male spirits became warriors and even chiefs. Now, you might be tempted to think of two-spirits as kind of like gay men, lesbian women, or trans people, but that would be a mistake. By doing that, we would be imposing our own terminology, our own biases, and ideas on their culture, which is a gross misrepresentation. They weren't gay or lesbian or trans. They were two-spirit. Okay, now that we've covered 3 different examples of gender systems that break out of the gender binary that dominates our culture, it's possible to ask ourselves, what can we learn from these examples? When you engage in cross-cultural comparisons, looking from one culture to another, you realize that there are many, many different ways of defining sex and gender. The way we do it in our society is on the basis of biology alone, which, as we saw before, has definite shortcomings, and it is by no means the universal way of defining sex. Other cultures define sex differently. At the most fundamental level, this tells us that our conceptions of gender and even sex cannot be accurately considered natural or biological. Instead, they are socially constructed. The definitions we create for sex become a part of our objective reality. We are socialized into this system, meaning that we are expected to internalize our society's sex structure, and then we begin to behave accordingly, externalizing what we've learned and ultimately perpetuating that system. In other words, no matter how you define sex and gender, it becomes a social system, a way of defining, laying out, and limiting the possibilities, a way of building walls. And as a system, it demands conformity. There will always be sex categories, whether there are 2, 3, 4, or more, but the categories will look different from culture to culture. Even the cisgender trans distinction is a system, one that beautifully diversifies our understanding of gender, but like all systems, it's confining nevertheless, and a binary one at that. Remember that our objective world has a significant impact on our inner subjective life. It affects our consciousness, our experiences, and the meanings these have for us. The way we understand and define sex and gender determines how we live our individual lives. In other words, much of our lives are mapped out for us in advance simply because of the sex categories, the boxes we occupy, and we had no choice in that. We do, however, have a choice in how we respond to that social system. We also have a choice in how we respond to those who reject that system. Collectively, our choices either reproduce or they challenge the objective reality as it currently exists.